Thank you for being here. Thank you to the organizers for organizing this wonderful conference. I'm Alex, this is Richard, and we're here to talk to you about an empirical study we did of classic students' play interest in ergodic characterization in historical video games. So we'll be delving into the world of historical games and play experiences today, and we're doing so mainly to increase our knowledge of how players actually play historical games. In 2017, in perhaps the seminal historical game studies article, Adam Chapman et al. Noted how in historical game studies has so far spent relatively little time examining the reactions, practices, and understandings of the players that actually utilize these games, which is relatively surprising for a field that often legitimizes itself through a criterion of popularity. Everybody plays games now, we often read, but how people actually play games has not received substantial attention. And it has to be said, however, that after Chapman et al.'s call to arms, there's been an increasing amount of work on historical game experiences with an ever-growing plenitude of articles and chapters that research this topic. And it's through this empirical body of research that our paper seeks to contribute today. And mainly we'll be doing so through the lens of characterization. Characterization is a term from literary studies referring to the process of attributing character or traits to a textual entity through various textual techniques or cues. It's the way a character is presented and said to be in the text. Games prove an especially interesting medium in this regard, as they have the relatively unique capacity to have the audience partake in the characterization process. Games can do that mainly as a consequence of their ergodic nature. And the word ergodic was first used by Espen Arset, who described ergodic literature as literature where non-trivial effort is required to allow the reader or player to traverse the text. In games, we have to do stuff. We have to perform deeds in order to traverse it through the text. And we may apply this to characterization, since in many games, the player is asked to participate in the characterization process of their character. Such a definition of ergodic characterization then could be that in ergodic characterization, non-trivial effort is required to allow the reader or player to characterize their character, which accounts for those instances where players are able and allowed to shape their own characters. An example of this is character configuration, where we choose the appearance or the appearance of the character or certain traits or skills. Another one is when games ask us to make meaningful choices, which may steer our character's personality in a specific direction. But note that not all forms of characterization in games are ergodic, only those cases in which players themselves produce non-trivial effort. But how do players actually characterize their characters when playing games? Which choices do they make? And how does this happen in historical video games? To that end, we hosted an empirical experiment with players where they played the historical video game Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which we've heard about today, released by Ubisoft Quebec in 2018. The game is set during the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta in ancient Greece, and we chose this game because it's still fairly recent and because it allows for relatively extensive choice making and customization, as well as character selection at the beginning of the game. Additionally, as we found in our experiment, this is a game from a series that has led some players to further pursue history or classics, or reversely, made classic students interested in historical gaming. So for these reasons, we believe it is a relevant game to study. And the questions we asked were, how do players ergodically characterize their player characters? Which motivations structure their in-game choices? And perhaps most importantly for our purposes today, what is the role, if any, that history plays in that process? We wanted to look at players' experiences of a historical video game through the lens of the player character and see if any historical motivations drove their decisions. Our experiments used a mixed methods approach where we combined both quantitative and qualitative data. Specifically, we had the participants actively play the game and describe their experience in both an open game diary in which they were able to write whatever they wanted, as well as specifically directed questionnaires. We then met with them after 2 weeks to elaborate on their notes and ask further questions. And we repeated this process 4 times, so for a total duration of 8 weeks in which they played the game for at least 3 hours every 2 weeks. And for the last meeting, we had them restart the game with the character they had initially not selected to see if there were any major differences there. In total, we had 10 participants who signed on for this experiment, all of whom did so voluntarily and did not receive course credits for this. 6 of whom came from Ghent University in Belgium, Group 1, so this is where I work, and 4 came from the University of Bristol in the UK, Group 2, where Richard works. 50% of them identified as male, 40% as female, and 10 preferred not to disclose their gender. Most of them were born between 2000 and 2004, though one participant was an older student. We also inquired inquired into what kind of game players they are, what kind of games they liked, and we found that commonly all of them prefer to play narrative, adventure-oriented games like Odyssey. And finally, our sample was also biased in a way by the fact that they were all students of classics, though we consider this an advantage, allowing us to gain further insight into the experiences of a group that scholarship hasn't really studied extensively before. First, we looked into the characters they selected. Odyssey allows players to play as either a male or female character, Alexios or Kassandra, a Spartan mercenary. Character selection does not change the story dramatically. It's the same story being told with a different protagonist. And we had an exact even split between Alexios and Kassandra, 5 each. And then we then checked into their motivations for selecting these characters, and we found 4 different reasons. First was gender parallel, or selecting the character of the gender with which the player themselves identifies. Trying the different perspective in a second playthrough, so playing as Alexios now if you've played as Kassandra before. Canonicity, so playing as Kassandra because Ubisoft officially said that in the wider lore of the franchise, Kassandra is the canonical character. Or finally, considerations of historical accuracy, so playing as Alexios because of the predominantly male evidence for warriors and mercenaries in antiquity. We, based on the participants' answers, we also were able to find 4 distinct play interests, or different types of motivations that structure the decisions players make in these games. First were ludic interests, which refer to the motivation that relate to an awareness of the game system as a game system, such as choosing something because it leads to certain advantages in the game, like experience points or loot, or because it means you'll later be able to do something else that you want, or choosing something because it is different from what you chose the last time you played, thereby being aware of what the game system offers and then wanting to explore other dimensions of it. Next are prosthetic interests, or those that derive from the player character almost being a prosthetic extension of the player in the game. These interests entail players choosing something just because they like it or value it whenever they play games or in real life. For example, riding a horse because that's what you like doing in games, or not killing in-game animals because you're against animal cruelty in real life. Third are narrative interests, or those that delve into the psychology of your character, such as choosing something because it is what your player character would do in a certain situation, even though it might run counter to your own decisions or your own value judgments. And finally, and perhaps most interestingly for us today, are referential interests, or those that create comparisons, contrasts, metaphors, or references with someone or something else. So choosing something because your player character resembles someone or something else who would do a certain thing. And this is where, as we'll see, historical motivations come in, as it is the perceived act of role-playing history that creates a metaphorical reference to a historical agent. Note that we're not presenting these 4 interests as fixed or static. They change, they evolve, they depend on the player's mood. They also nicely exhibit the same division often made in game character research between the game character and avatar. So the avatar as the ludic dimension, the in-game embodiment or the tool, whereas the character dimension refers to it being a fictional narrative entity. And finally, the 4 motivators that drove the character selection process also map very neatly onto these interests. Exploring a different perspective is a ludic interest, gender parallel is a prosthetic one, canonicity is narrative, and historical accuracy is referential. And so we consider this a useful framework to think about player choice in these types of games.
So the role of history. Let's look a little bit more into the role that history plays in all of this. We already saw that history was one of the motivations for character selection. Generally, all our participants enjoyed the game's historical dimension, its detail, and the opportunities they had for engaging with history. It gave them a chance to explore the ancient world up close, to meet characters, visualize things differently, and even gain new perspectives. This also led to an increase in curiosity. One student, 1E, said that they explored more in Odyssey than they do in other games to really investigate how antiquity was reconstructed by the game. Furthermore, players felt immersed into the historical atmosphere of the game and wanted to actively contribute to that atmosphere or experience. They wanted their experience to feel historical, and so they equipped items or armor that contributed to that experience. Or they performed actions that their character considered authentic, such as sort of using non-fantastical skills. In historical game studies, we've seen discussions of the power of atmospheres in such games, but here we were able to see that players actively wanted to contribute to that feeling and to co-create their experience. The historical referential interests they had were also in part personal and flexible within their co-creation of a historical atmosphere. They focused on items or elements that they found interesting or researched for their courses, for example. Finally, we also saw that historical fact-checking did not make up a regular or important part of their gameplay. Two of them did go on to look up at least one thing in their history textbooks, but most did not actually go on and check whether what they saw was accurate. Most of them actually trusted what was portrayed. Yet the involvement of history should perhaps also be nuanced. So consider this quote from the experience of student 2D. What was most interesting about this is that they said, I'm involved in classics day to day, and the game is an extension of that. So it's a kind of sort of transmedial argument, but with their education as the framework. So they experience the game within that framework, but they also are just experiencing the game as a game. It's within their own mind and thoughts. So it's a fictional playthrough rather than something that they play in terms of sort of historically accurate assumptions, as they mention here. So the students also want to play these games, not as study objects. But at the same time, the game exists in a kind of continuum with their studies. So we see that history certainly directs the game experience for some players, but not exclusively. It also overlaps and intersects with other play interests, such as...
For example, we also saw that some players role-played their character as a Greek hero. For example, student 1C wrote that because he comes off as pretty arrogant and impulsive in scenes where I'm unable to make choices, Alexios reminds me of Achilles, so I often make choices that I believe an Achilles would make as well. When I want to play more cautiously and make more cautious or smarter choices, I do so thinking of Odysseus. Or for example, 2B said, previously I have treated them like Achilles or an assassin from the franchise, or 1B an imitation of these heroes. And this effectively leads to a rather hybrid historical/mythological experience, which is often the case for ancient Greece and modern receptions, and may have been exactly what the developers were aiming at. Benjamin Hall and Thierry Dansereau from Ubisoft Quebec explained in a GDC talk that the mission statement for the game was, during the golden age of ancient Greece, determine your path on the epic Odyssey of a legendary Greek hero. So these hybrid history-myth experiences may have been exactly the point. Interestingly, the way these students described their Greek hero experiences seemed to be in line with modern superheroes. For example, 1C wrote that I try to make the choices that seem morally best in order to align my character to the image I have of a classical hero, or that I play my character as not publicly heroic per se, but more as a hero in the background. Being morally exemplary or operating in the background, in the shadows, are elements that recall contemporary superheroes more than ancient Greek heroes. Achilles didn't operate in the shadows, like Batman does, for example. And as modern feminist retellings of myth have emphasized, Greek heroes often stray far from morality. So there's an overlap here that players may not necessarily be aware of. Also, we found that Greek hero roleplay often decreased over time because it got in the way of narrative immersion, as we see here. So we may hypothesize that such play strategies may occur primarily when starting the game in order to contribute to the historical atmosphere, but gradually fade in importance as the story goes on. Also, most of these heroic characterizations were found with Alexios players, and upon changing to a different character, those players noted that these parallels did not emerge when I played Kassandra. This leads us to believe that such heroism is gendered, and that such conceptualizations may be added to a small list of differences between playing as Alexios or Kassandra. Playing as Alexios may invite stronger parallels with the typical Greek heroes of myth. This does not mean that Kassandra players might not mythologize their experience. Some players did draw parallels between her and the Amazons, or with the character Camilla from Virgil's Aeneid, so an Amazon queen who joins the war between Aeneas and Turnus and whose heroic deeds are described at length in the book. But in general, we found fewer evidence for this experience with Kassandra than we did with Alexios. So to conclude, what we presented here today was empirical research into players' experiences and ergodic characterization processes in historical games, where we saw that different play interests drive gameplay, one of which relates to considerations of history. Historical motivations certainly do direct players' behavior in these games, although they don't do that exclusively. Other considerations such as ludic, prosthetic, or narrative ones also do that. Such interests can also combine in interesting ways. But perhaps the main takeaway of our presentation today is let's spend more time with players. This kind of research leads to highly illuminating insights, and there's still so many avenues left untaken. So thank you very much, and we're looking forward to the discussion.